Hey y'all. In 2012, a teenage boy from Tennessee committed an unthinkable crime. With known mental disorders, the question became, was this really insanity? Or was it evil? Just a reminder, you can find content warnings for this and all episodes in the show notes. This one is not for the faint of heart. I'm Candace, and I'll be your guide. In 1997, in Hendersonville, Tennessee, Chris and Melanie Davis welcomed their second child, Zachary, into the world. Only a year younger than his older brother Josh, the two grew up really close friends. The boy's father, Chris, battled ALS, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease. ALS is a fatal, progressive neurological disease that causes gradual muscle wasting. Patients typically go from discoordination to a wheelchair to eventually their diaphragm, the muscle that helps with breathing, failing. ALS is the disease that famous theoretical physicist Stephen Hawking battled for decades, an exceptionally longer period of time than the average ALS patient. In 2007, Chris Davis lost his battle with ALS, leaving behind his loving wife and two little boys. Their mom, Melanie, was an Australian citizen who immigrated to the U.S. to marry Chris. She worked as a paralegal and enjoyed participating in triathlons in her spare time. After the death of her husband, she tried hard to move on and keep life as normal as possible for her boys, Josh and Zach. However, the younger son, Zach, struggled exceptionally with the loss of his father. Shortly after his father's passing, Melanie took Zach to see a psychiatrist, Dr. Bradley Freeman at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. The psychiatrist notes that Zach clearly had a mental defect, as he called it. He went on to diagnose Zachary with schizophrenia and depression that he sums up as a depressive disorder with psychosis. This is largely due to the fact that Zachary told him during a session that he heard the voice of his dead father day in and day out. Dr. Freeman acknowledges that of course it's entirely normal for someone to fall into a deep depression after the loss of a close and beloved family member. But the doctor also notes that while Zachary had experienced the numbness and depression typical of the grieving process, he had not managed to move on to recovery. This is most likely because after 4 sessions, Melanie did not take Zach back to see the psychiatrist. Despite hearing his dead father's voice, despite those diagnoses, he never went back. It's generally acknowledged that as a teenager, Zach was a pretty odd guy. He speaks with a very flat affect, kind of like Carl from Sling Blade. The classmates called a monotonous whisper. He was noted to wear the same hoodie every day and to wear the hood of it up over his head day in and day out. It was suspected that he never washed it. Some classmates felt that he was incredibly creepy, moving, walking, and sitting in the exact same fashion with the same mannerisms every time. Only speaking to others when spoken to and responding in as few whispered words as possible, rarely smiling and just playing games on his phone throughout the school day. It seems he didn't have any friends and was sadly considered to be an outcast by his peers at Station Camp High School. To make matters worse, he had an app about serial killers on his phone and was believed to idolize them, as well as another app detailing torture devices. He carried a notebook where he had written, quote, "You can't spell slaughter without laughter," unquote. August 10th, 2012 started out like any other day for 15-year-old Zach and his family. The boys wanted to go see the new movie, The Campaign, so Melanie took them out for a fun family day at the movie theater. After the movie, they made their way home, and around 9 o'clock or so, Melanie made her way to bed as usual. After she goes to bed, Zachary packed his backpack with some belongings, including clothing, a toothbrush, some notebooks, gloves, a ski mask, and a claw hammer. He then crept to the basement and retrieved a heavy sledgehammer. He snuck back upstairs and quietly opened the door to his mother's room. He later states that he stood there, one hand on the doorknob, the other holding the sledgehammer, staring at his mother sleeping peacefully in her bed. His mind was blank, his eyes empty as they often looked. He stepped to her bedside, and in her slumber, he raised that sledgehammer over his head and brought it down forcefully onto his mother's skull. He proceeded to smash her skull repeatedly, blood and brain matter spattering his clothing and Melanie's bedroom. After the second blow, Zachary recalls seeing her eyes open and staring blankly momentarily before she began seizing. He continued, blow after blow, until he was certain that his mother was dead. Zachary later estimates he bludgeoned her about 20 times. He then locks his mother's bedroom door and closes it behind him, going into the nearby game room where he douses the room with a combination of whiskey and gasoline before setting it ablaze. This was all with the intention of his brother Josh dying in the fire. He closed the door to the game room as well, and Zachary grabbed that prepared backpack and left the home on foot. Thankfully, the closed doors allowed for the fire to spread more slowly, awakening Josh to the sound of the smoke detectors in the home. Josh immediately went to their mother's room to find her door locked, which was unusual. He broke down the door to see copious amounts of blood on the bed and spattered everywhere else, and quickly realizes exactly what has happened. He quickly escapes the house fire and runs to a neighbor's home to report the murder and the arson. An APB was immediately put out for Zachary Davis, and about 5 hours later, a sheriff's deputy spotted Zach walking along a 2-lane road, 5 to 10 miles from his home, depending on the source. He was arrested without incident and quickly confessed that he had killed his mother in her sleep. Chillingly, Sheriff Sonny Weatherford says that during the confession, Zachary had a sickening smile on his face the entire time. 2 months before his trial began, Dr. Phil McGraw of the TV show Dr. Phil had an exclusive interview with Zach. During the interview, his flat speech and unusual upward nod were really disconcerting, as was the occasional soft chuckle he gave when responding to questions. At one point, Dr. Phil asked if Melanie made a noise when Zachary swung the sledgehammer, and this was his reply.
I could just hear the hammer hitting her head. There was this wet thumping sound.
He chuckles softly when recalling the sound of the sledgehammer hitting his mother's skull. It's honestly sickening. Zach recounts that the reason he murdered his mother was because she, quote, wasn't taking care of my family, unquote. At the time, he couldn't elaborate further on what he meant, just explaining that on August 10th, he'd had enough. In April 2015, a jury of 7 men and 5 women had been chosen and assembled for the murder trial. The defense argued that Zachary was not guilty by reason of insanity. The prosecution argued that it was clearly premeditated, which negates the argument of insanity. His videotaped confession was played for the jury, where he explains that the disembodied voice of his dead father instructed him to kill his mother. His videotaped confession was played for the jury, where he explains that the disembodied voice of his dead father instructed him to kill his mother. During that confession, when asked if he could go back in time to change anything, Zach explains that he would kill Josh with a sledgehammer too. He also explains that he chose the sledgehammer as the murder weapon because he felt that it gave the highest chances of quote-unquote success. He wanted the highest chance of killing her, and that's why he chose the sledgehammer over a knife or another weapon. He also explained that the reason he bludgeoned her so many times was that he wanted to make sure she was dead. Zach also informed the court that he put a pillow over her face after the first couple of blows because he wanted to make sure the gurgling noises she was making as she died didn't wake his brother. On day 2 of the 4-day trial, evidence from one of Zachary's journals was presented, where he claims that years prior, his brother Josh raped him. This journal entry was dated August 10th, 2012, the same day that Zach killed their mother. There had been no mention of this rape in his journals prior to this date. He claims that ever since the rape, he has planned to seek revenge against his brother. Josh denies that anything like this ever happened and that he loved his brother and can't imagine why he would make false claims about something so hurtful. The Department of Children's Services ultimately did a thorough investigation about the claims and found no evidence that any sexual assault took place amongst the brothers. Zachary also lists this as a reason for harboring such anger against their mother, that he had told only her what had happened and that she didn't do anything about it. On trial day 3, amongst the frequent bouts of inappropriate and maniacal laughter, Zachary abruptly changes his story. And when I say abruptly, I mean his attorney wasn't even aware of what was happening. While on the stand, Zach suddenly recants his confession and explains that Josh killed their mother, Melanie. That Zach made up the entire confession to cover for his brother. He argued this repeatedly while on the stand. His attorney, Randy Lucas, stunned and wide-eyed over this sudden unanticipated change of plans, had to remind Zachary, his own client, that he not only wrote out his murder plans in his journal ahead of the attack, but his mother's blood was splattered all over his clothing when he was arrested. The court called Dr. Bradley Freeman to the stand, the psychiatrist who initially diagnosed a young Zachary Davis yet didn't get to see him past a few visits. Dr. Freeman explains, quote, "His judgment was driven by his psychosis. That's what I believe prevents him from premeditating this crime," unquote. A court-appointed psychologist who had approximately 30 visits with Zachary since his arrest also took the stand. She explains, quote, "I've never seen someone so clearly detached from his emotions," unquote, adding that she also diagnosed him with schizophrenia and depression. The prosecution argued that despite any potential mental illness he may have, Zachary displayed clear acts of premeditation. He plotted the murder in his journal for days leading up to the attack. He poured gasoline and whiskey into the game room before starting the fire. He prepared a bag and threw his cell phone into a ditch so that police could not trace it. Family members and family friends noted that, yeah, Zach was a weird kid, but they never thought that he would be capable of acts of violence. And the family got along well and had a good dynamic. A computer forensics expert states that the family exchanged amicable text messages on the day of the attack. Sadly, Zach's paternal grandmother states that if he had received the psychiatric care he needed in his youth, none of this would have happened. The jury struggled with the fact that the crime did seem premeditated, but he was clearly very mentally ill. Ultimately, after the 4-day trial concluded, it only took the jury 3 hours to convict Zachary Davis of first-degree murder as well as attempted murder, which he received a sentence of life in prison plus 20 years. Following the sentencing, Sumner County DA Ray Whiteley says, quote, "I think that Zach Davis is a little bit smarter and a little bit wilier than we give him credit for," unquote. Currently, Zachary Davis is imprisoned at Lois DeBerry Special Needs Facility in Nashville for mental health care throughout his incarceration. His potential release date is 2076, when he is 79 years old. His brother, Josh Davis, has been lying low and leading a private life since the trial. Little is known about his life currently. Little is also known about the life of the Davis family after the father, Chris, passed away. But it is possible that if Zach had only gotten the mental health care he so obviously needed as a child, that the situation wouldn't have happened. That's the case of the Sledgehammer Killer. Now let's talk about it. Now, obviously, we don't know why Melanie didn't take Zach back to the psychiatrist. I know that even an 11-year-old child can certainly dig their heels in the ground about doing things they need to do. I don't know the situation, but it is so incredibly sad because things could have been so different. That one small action of hers was the end of her life, or could have been that way. I really wish I could find more information on Chris, their dad, the one who died of ALS, and what life was like before and after his passing. Because, of course, obviously there's bound to be a lot of grief and a lot of problems with the family afterward. But I'd love to know if it just became dysfunctional. If maybe the kids struggled exceptionally with just day-to-day life. If maybe Melanie wasn't there for them because she couldn't even be there for herself, I'd love to know more about that situation to kind of see what did happen. Okay, y'all need to watch that Dr. Phil interview. You can find it on YouTube. You can look up Interview with the Sledgehammer Killer because it is chilling and fascinating. Zachary's mannerisms. I can't even put it into words. That upward nod he does with his head. I struggle to describe whether his eyes look empty or whether they just look cold and completely uncaring. But y'all, please watch that interview just for a few minutes and tell me what you think about it. I do think Zachary is clearly very conniving. He may not come across as I'm sorry to say, a very intellectual criminal, but that rape story is too convenient that he never mentioned that in any journal, and it sounds like he was a pretty dedicated journaler. He had numerous notebooks. He never mentioned that until the day he planned on killing his mom, and then suddenly it was a big stumbling block in his history. And I do hate to just not believe someone who says that happened to them, but I'm sorry, I don't. I think it was a really convenient excuse that he never mentioned until that day. And then trying to spin his entire story to pin the crime on Josh mid-trial. He may not be the brightest criminal, but he is definitely crafty. He is craftier than he gets credit for. It does sound like he just did aspire to be a serial killer. People who knew him said that that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to be a serial killer. The claw hammer in his backpack, ski mask, gloves, all that. Why did he pack that in his bag if he was done? If his goal was just to kill his mom and Josh and leave and to start a new life somewhere, he wouldn't have taken a claw hammer, a ski mask, and gloves. I think he was just searching for reasons to make it sound like his family deserved what he did to them. As always, I want to know what you think. I would ask if it's a case of insanity or evil or both, but I really don't think many of us would disagree that it's both. But let me know. Let me know your thoughts. You can find me on social media at obscureappalachia or on the pod's website at obscureappalachia.com. Feel free to send me your personal paranormal and true crime stories to obscureappalachia@gmail.com. Y'all know the drill. Subscribe, review, all that jazz. Thanks, y'all. Until next time.